Let's look at the Valley of Mexico in early 1519. From an administrative standpoint, the Aztec Empire, or more accurately, the Triple Alliance, was running a fairly lucrative operation. It was a sprawling network of roughly 5 to 6 million people, structured around a central hub called Tenochtitlan. The city was built in the middle of Lake Texcoco, housed over 200,000 residents, and functioned on an elaborate system of chinampas, floating agricultural beds that kept the workforce fed. On paper, the management had everything under control. Emperor Moctezuma II sat at the top of a strict hierarchy, collecting regular shipments of gold, jade, feathers, and agricultural surplus from hundreds of client city-states. There was, however, a critical structural flaw in the business model. The Aztec Empire did not assimilate the lands it conquered. It merely extracted tribute from them at spear point, which meant that underneath the impressive architecture and the orderly markets, the entire region was a pressure cooker of deeply bitter client states who hated the central office. They were simply waiting for anyone, literally anyone, to show up with an alternative. In February 1519, Cortés landed on the coast of Veracruz. He was not representing the Spanish crown in an official state-sanctioned campaign. In fact, the governor of Cuba had explicitly cancelled his expedition right before he sailed. Cortés simply ignored the memo, took 11 ships, about 500 soldiers, 16 horses, and a few light cannons, and set off to execute an unauthorized corporate takeover. When you look at the raw numbers, 500 men against an empire of millions sounds like a statistical impossibility. But Cortés wasn't a military genius so much as an opportunistic political auditor. He quickly realized that the local populations weren't loyal subjects of the Aztec throne. They were unwilling taxpayers. When the Spaniards marched inward, they didn't fight the local Tlaxcalan people for long. Instead, after a few brief skirmishes, the Tlaxcalans realized Cortés could be used as a heavy weapon against their long-time oppressors in Tenochtitlan. So Cortés didn't invade Mexico with 500 men. He invaded Mexico with 500 Spaniards and roughly 20,000 deeply motivated regional allies who were more than happy to help liquidate the central government. By November 1519, the joint force arrived at the gates of Tenochtitlan. Moctezuma, attempting to avoid an immediate military conflict that would disrupt the seasonal tribute cycles, invited the Spaniards inside the city as guests. This was a catastrophic diplomatic error. Tenochtitlan was a logistical miracle, a city connected to the mainland only by narrow causeways, easily defensible and capable of trapping an invading army instantly if the bridges were raised. Instead of securing the perimeter, Moctezuma allowed the foreign party directly into the imperial palace. Within a week, Cortés did the simplest, most audacious thing possible. He put Moctezuma under informal house arrest inside his own capital. For months, the entire Aztec Empire was governed by a captive CEO who issued orders to his people while sitting in a room guarded by foreign soldiers. It was a bizarre, fragile stalemate where the daily operations of the empire continued, but the ultimate authority had been completely hijacked. Predictably, a system this unstable could not hold. In mid-1520, Cortés had to temporarily leave the city to deal with a Spanish arrest squad sent by the governor of Cuba, the guy whose orders he had ignored a year earlier. He left his deputy, Pedro de Alvarado, in charge of Tenochtitlan. Alvarado lacked even basic diplomatic instincts. Fearing a potential uprising during a major Aztec religious festival, he ordered a preemptive strike on an unarmed crowd of nobles in the Great Temple. That single decision ruined the entire operation. The local population abandoned all diplomatic protocol, took up arms, and placed the palace under absolute siege. When Cortés returned from defeating his own country's arrest squad, he walked straight into a total administrative collapse. Moctezuma was brought out to calm the crowd, hit by a stone thrown by his own furious citizens, and died shortly after. On the night of June 30th, 1520, later documented as La Noche Triste, or the Night of Sorrows, the Spanish and their allies attempted a silent middle-of-the-night retreat along the western causeway. It went terribly. The alarm was raised, the causeways were cut, and hundreds of canoes swarmed the lake. From an asset recovery standpoint, it was a disaster. Much of the gold the Spaniards had spent months collecting was so heavy that the men carrying it drowned in the mud of Lake Texcoco. The expedition lost roughly 2/3 of its Spanish personnel and thousands of Tlaxcalan allies in a matter of hours. Cortés survived, sat under a cypress tree on the mainland, and reportedly wept. Not out of sentimental grief, but because his entire venture was currently sitting at the bottom of a lake, completely devoid of capital. If this were a standard military story, the Aztec Empire would have reorganized its forces, fortified the lake, and ended the threat permanently. Except during the brief Spanish stay in the capital, an invisible, uninvited variable had been introduced into the Mesoamerican ecosystem: smallpox. The indigenous populations of the Americas had zero historical exposure to European pathogens, meaning they had zero biological immunity. While Cortés was retreating to Tlaxcala to rebuild his army, smallpox swept through Tenochtitlan like an unscheduled operational wipeout. In a matter of weeks, an estimated 40 to 50% of the city's population died, including the new emperor Cuitláhuac, who had just spent months organizing the defense. The disease didn't just remove combatants, it targeted the farmers, the water carriers, the civil servants, and the military command. By the time the Spaniards were ready to return, the city's operational capacity had already been shattered from within. In May 1521, Cortés returned with a rebuilt army of Spaniards, over 100,000 native allies, and 13 custom-built armed brigantines that he had hauled overland and launched into Lake Texcoco. He didn't try to storm the city directly this time. He cut the aqueducts that supplied fresh drinking water to the island, blocked the causeways to stop food shipments, and instituted a strict 3-month naval blockade. What followed was 83 days of systematic demolition. The new Aztec leader, Cuauhtémoc, refused every offer of surrender, fighting block by block as the city starved. The Spaniards used their artillery and native allies to flatten every building they captured, pushing the rubble into the canals to create wider roads for their cavalry. By August 13th, 1521, the last defenses collapsed. The great floating city of Tenochtitlan was gone, replaced by a field of ruin. Which brings us to the actual purpose of today's look at history: the ledger, the human cost. When historians look at the conquest of Mexico, they usually divide the deaths into two distinct categories: the immediate direct combat casualties of 1519 to 1521, and the long-term demographic collapse that followed. During the 83-day siege of Tenochtitlan alone, modern estimates place the immediate native casualties, between combat, starvation, and contaminated water, at roughly 100,000 to 240,000 people. The vast majority of these were civilians living inside the blockaded capital. When you add the regional battles, the destruction of neighboring cities, and the heavy losses among Spanish-aligned native forces, the direct military conquest accounted for roughly 300,000 total fatalities over a 2-year window. But those numbers, as grim as they are, were merely the opening balance. The real invoice was paid over the next 50 years through a sequence of catastrophic disease outbreaks, smallpox, measles, and a terrifying hemorrhagic fever known locally as cocolistli. In 1519, before the arrival of the ships, the population of central Mexico was estimated by modern demographic studies to be somewhere between 15 million and 25 million people. By 1580, 6 decades after the fall of Tenochtitlan, that number had dropped to approximately 1.5 million. That is a population reduction of roughly 90 to 95%. Over 20 million human beings were permanently removed from the ledger in under a century due to systemic collapse, forced labor under the encomienda system, and repeated biological epidemics. It remains one of the largest demographic contractions in the history of the human species. The Aztec Empire wasn't destroyed by 500 men with swords. It was undone by a fractured political system that turned its own allies into an invading force and an invisible biological disaster that did the heavy lifting long before the final blockade was even built. The city was eventually rebuilt, renamed Mexico City, and drained of its lakes. The water was gone, the empire was gone, and the receipt was paid in full. I'll be here, unfortunately,